Okay, so here we go. Yeah. So HR in times of challenge, and particularly when funds are a problem. As you see in the image there, when funds are a problem, we feel a little bit like that little man, and we don't want to fall into the water. It does feel in our mind that if we fall down, there'll be kind of sharks waiting for us. So whether the coin moves or not, we want to stay kind of with the right balance, and we want to make sure that our people stays also on that right balance. But what are we going to cover today, just with that a small kind of image in our background, in our mind? At the end of the session, in 15 minutes, we have the challenge to look at what are the factors that HR needs to consider where funds are a problem. We will also be looking at what potential options are there to reduce staffing costs, particularly in the short term, in the medium term, and in the long term. And we'll be also looking at how does HR work with others in leadership to make decisions and communicate with them. So let's do it. So when funding is a problem, what are the key things that HR needs to consider? And I'm going to start by the end rather than by the beginning. Reason why the green box, I've put it with an arrow, because it's at the end, but it should be all the way through. One of the lines in one of the readings that Jane and Cindy share with us, it says, the biggest mistake that HR can make is to keep silence, even when we don't have all the elements. So even from the very beginning, when ourselves, we don't know what is happening, neither the impact of what might be happening, the worst we can do is to not communicate. And this links with the fact that we must do that with soft skills, we must do that through our managers, but we must communicate, even if it is to say, we do not know yet, but we are actually planning together along with the leadership team about the times ahead, and communicate regularly. And having said that, which will be all through the process, what we need to consider is that we need to understand, know what is happening. In order to know what is happening, we need to consult in the organization, but we need to also consult with other people outside the organization, maybe peers, maybe people in the sector, maybe people that are impacted with similar situations. And at the moment, particularly, we're talking about funding being potentially a problem, maybe as a consequence of COVID-19. We have heard that maybe country leaders are starting to project what will happen if we have a 20% cut in funding. What will be the potential outcomes? We don't know what it will be. Maybe funds come back up very soon, and we all hope that. But if there is a funding cut that affects the organization for a period of time, we need to understand what is happening and how to react to that. We need to understand also what areas and how people will be affected before they even feel that. What areas particularly in the organization? Is it a particular activity in one particular region of our country, which means that as a consequence, the people working on that particular program might be more affected, but not the rest? What is it? What area? And how people will be affected. And we, as we keep emphasizing all through these 3 days, people are our most important asset. People are really at the center of what we do. So we must be aware of what's happening to them from the outside, the obvious, but also from the inside. And then we must step back. We must step back once we've understood what's happening and look at options, prepare and adjust. And when I'm saying a stepping back is because straight away we might be thinking, oh, that's it, we won't be able to continue. But there are always options, and we'll be looking at some of them in the next few minutes. Make a plan, obviously not on our own, and I'm going to repeat this, not on our own, is not our responsibility. We don't have to carry that burden on our own. It's true that HR is crucial, and we will walk along with other leaders in the organization to really provide a solution so that the operations can continue, so that we can continue to do what we have been called to do. And again, I'll highlight communicate all the way through with our people, of what stages are we in terms of facing the funding gaps. But what areas particularly will be affected, or can we expect that might be potentially affected? If we were planning recruitment, maybe we are going to have to freeze it for a while and just kind of look at the big picture, see if maybe those new roles were really necessary. If we were having a very generous training budget, and maybe it's not the case for most of us, but if we were, maybe we need to revisit that, because maybe our country leader is looking at the budget of the year and where there could be some cuts. If we were maybe planning some salary increases, salary reviews, maybe that needs to wait for a little bit. So maybe there's conversations that maybe we might not be able to do that straight away, but maybe we might have to wait a little bit. If we were planning very generously to bring new benefits to the organization, or to kind of bring extra additional things, maybe we need to revisit, maybe we need to find more competitive kind of providers that can give us a better price, so that we can contribute to reduce costs. If we were planning kind of promotion paths because we wanted to kind of bring people up and as a consequence increase their salaries, it doesn't mean that it has to stop, but maybe we need to kind of slow down a little bit that path and just see, okay, is it the right time now, or do we have to wait a little bit, or do it differently? But for sure there'll be uncertainty around us, there'll be uncertainty, and not only on staff, there'll be uncertainty also among the leaders. So again, it's extremely important that we communicate and we understand what is happening. Also, as is being highlighted by Ian, employee well-being is absolutely key. Employee relations also are key. When there is tension, people start looking at each other, people start thinking, is it gonna be me? Who is making these decisions? As a consequence of the changes we are all going through, productivity might be affected. For example, at the moment, many of us are working from home. Maybe we cannot perform the same, we cannot produce the same, or internet connections are not as reliable, or ability to concentrate for an entire day is not the same as we have maybe our families around. Performance management might be something that is neglected by managers because they are themselves too busy. They are themselves dealing with the uncertainty of potential funding constraints and their anxiety around it. Development might be easily neglected. We think that maybe that's not priority anymore, but we really have to pay attention to that. Retention, extremely important. Rather keep the people that are valuable to the organization with us. Do not neglect that. Do not let them go. Do not let them think that they'll be more secure somewhere else if we can. Absence management is something we'll need to pay attention to due to a big number of factors. People might feel they are not motivated. People might feel that there is no hope, and as a consequence there is no trust anymore, unless we really work hard along other leaders to really reassure people with what we can. But being honest with people also, because ultimately when there is funding cuts, things need to happen in order for us to be able to continue operations. And primarily what we want is to try to think about any sort of options that will not touch people. And what could they be? They could be, for example, reduced hours or days of work for staff. They could be, for example, changed rosters or shifts. So if people were working on a particular program or in a particular hospital, maybe we can just move them around so that they cover where the need is at the moment. We could enforce annual leave instead of letting people accumulate. Maybe we might ask them to take it now so that we can go through this temporary period where funding is a problem. We could, even though it's very painful process, reduce salary. Maybe we could agree that everyone gets a small percentage cut in order to be able to maintain everyone on board. we could consider government schemes if there are any in your country. For example, in the UK, we have a scheme that allows staff to be on hold for a while, and then the government pays part of it. But very, very important, let's ask people for ideas. We might think about plenty of options, but ultimately it's people that might give us the solution. So why don't just propose to our leaders to have a meeting with our staff to tell us what do they think we can do in the face of potential funding cuts. If we do have to eventually go through the gap, we want at all costs to keep our people on board, but that's not always possible. And if we do have to let people go, we have to make sure that we do that well, that we do that legally, and that we do that having in consideration that they are people, they are not what we call assets. So what are the sort of things we are going to look at in the short term? Maybe we are going to look at terminating the contracts that they were due to end anyway. They were expecting that was going to happen. So maybe that's what we're going to look at first. Then if we still need to reduce staffing, we might look at those contracts that are less than 2 years in the duration and see whether maybe there can be a compromise if that is possible, and we can maybe end them before. And maybe we can have conversations about the possibility to re-engage these people once the funding cut maybe recovers. Maybe we can rotate the staff or review their JDs. Maybe a particular activity is finishing, but maybe we can use them somewhere else, maybe for a different position. But these are probably the immediate things we will be looking at. In the medium term, if we really have to look at reducing permanent staff, it's extremely important that we do this in consultation, that we communicate, and transparency there is the key. That we communicate to staff the why, that we communicate to staff the bigger goal, so that everyone buys in. We might have to do specific consultations with individuals or wider consultations with kind of all staff. That might at times have to lead to potential redundancies, but rather than have to choose, which at times might be a painful process, maybe we can promote handhold voluntary early retirements or voluntary redundancies. This means that people might already in their minds had been thinking that was their time to maybe look at a new path in their careers. And maybe if we make this a voluntary option, we might have people that steps back and says, I'd be prepared to have that conversation. But extremely important, preparing staff for changes, those that might be eventually considering to leave, but those that also are going to stay. Because any change that will mean that people goes will affect the entire organization. Because ultimately, in essence, we are like a family, and especially in those environments where we work very close together. In the long term, this very strictly means reorganization, means restructure, means redundancies. If that funding cut remains really in the long term, this is really the ultimate option. We will look at every other option rather than this. But if we have to get to that, maybe we will have to look at what we call outplacement. Those people that maybe are leaving the organization, we want to do that properly. We want to make sure we help them in the next step in their careers. We want to make sure we help them to give them time so that they can go to other interviews, that we help them maybe to build their CVs, that we help them so that we even train them for new interviews that they may have out there with other employers. We might have frozen salaries, as we saw earlier on, until the funding restrictions ease. We might have to study the impact at all levels and the long-term cost. And when I'm saying the long-term cost of hiring, it is because we have to really look at, is that the best position? If I'm letting someone go now, but in 6 months' time, this person or this particular role needs to be re-engaged, what is the cost of re-engaging someone? Is it really worth to let that person go? But as I said, these measures are really the ultimate solution. What can we do with other managers all through the process, from the very beginning to the end? Set expectations, make sure everyone is clear about what to expect. Invite commitment from everyone in the organization. Make sure that the staff understands that ultimately the most important is to keep serving those affected by leprosy. That is more important than my position in the leprosy nation, than anyone's position. God will look after us whatever happens. Measure progress, make sure that whatever decision we make is properly measured, and that we ensure that that contributes towards defeating leprosy, because that's what we want to do. That's our central objective. Provide feedback to everyone all the way through. Work with other managers to do that. Link to consequences, where other managers maybe propose things that you think are too abrupt. Try to link their propositions to consequences. And finally, evaluate effectiveness all through the process. Have in mind this simple approach, and try to think in the conversations I'm having with other managers, I am kind of measuring or putting into the conversation all these ideas, all these simple kind of ideas. Nearly have these stickers somewhere and ask your managers about each of them. And finally, whatever happens, just remember that God commands us to be strong and courageous, to not be afraid, neither discouraged, because whether we stay, whether we go, God is with us. And ultimately, we are serving people affected by leprosy, and God will not let us down whether we continue. And we pray that any funding gap that is ahead might be quickly recover, so that we can just stay all on board. Thank you.